I'm making my own way, but I stumble and I falter every day. But I love my baby now. When I love my baby, I'm still learning how. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Stay with me.
Good evening, and welcome to Pathways to Parenting Success, How to Reduce Family Conflict. I'd like to thank everybody who's here tonight, our panelists, our audience, and particularly I would like to thank our partners, the Boulder Valley School District and the Boulder Valley Media Alliance and Channel 22. I'm Alicia Connors-Bauer. I'm the Program Manager for Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, and I will be your moderator this evening. So what we're going to do this evening is we have a panel of experts who will present on various topics related to family conflict. I would like to encourage you to submit questions. If you're in our audience, you can submit questions live. Just write them down and turn them in, and we'll address your questions. If you're watching from home or online, we would like to take your questions as well, and you can submit those through www.boulderpsychologicalservices.com and click on submit questions icon. So I'd like to get us started this evening with our first speaker, who is Dr. Elizabeth Matthews. Elizabeth has been practicing psychotherapy with teens and adults in Boulder and Louisville for 15 years. Prior to obtaining her professional counseling license in 2001, she worked at Centennial Peaks Hospital and Attention Homes. A frequent community speaker, Elizabeth has also been published in the Daily Camera and Thrive magazine. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Mark Twain is credited with saying, "I've experienced many terrible things in my life, a few of which actually happened." I think that's true for most of us, that we diminish our life experience because we worry and fret over things that oftentimes don't actually happen. Yet we allow stress and worry to rob us of clarity, common sense, and meaningful relationships. And why is that? Well, one thing I want to talk about tonight is the fight or flight response. It's a type of human wisdom located in the reptilian part of the brain. When we experience stress because of internal worries or external circumstances, our bodies and mind begin communicating by releasing chemicals and firing nerve cells that prepare us for the enemy. Some of the things that happen: we breathe more shallow, our digestion slows down, muscles tense, pupils dilate. The chemical system set into motion by the fight or flight response moves us into an attack mode. This was very effective perhaps when we were cave dwellers and we were neighbors with tigers, but it's not so good when we're dealing with our family. Fight or flight mode, we abandon our integrated, loving, and intelligent selves, the very parts of us that could be most effective and most appropriate in a family crisis. And when our fight or flight is stimulated, it invokes a similar chemical response from our loved ones. So when we start and then they start, everybody just wants to either do battle or escape. So what to do to calm things down, to make conversations more loving and constructive? Well, there's no quick fix, but I'd like to offer some suggestions. The first time for long-term preparation. It's not just loved ones that trigger our survival mode. We have traffic, electronics, our work environment, news, etc. And these stressors aren't neutralized in some way. The tension from these stressors flows into our personal lives. So the trick is to learn how to balance daily life stressors with de-stressors before the family conflict begins. So on your everyday life, you need to work in some ways to work off the tension. Take a walk. Make sure that alcohol and caffeine is used in moderation. get a good night's sleep. I can't say enough about getting a good night's sleep, not only for the parents, but for the children as well. Eat healthy foods, try meditation, prayer, or simply breathing, and pay attention to your thoughts. And if you're noticing that they tend to go towards the negative, try to make them more neutral, because neutral is actually probably a whole lot closer to the truth of the situation anyways. And of course, exercise. Exercise helps us metabolize the excessive stress hormones that we experience in modern life. And when it comes to fight or flight, just 5 minutes of exercise, work up a light sweat, feel a little bit winded, and you're help counteracting the fight or flight response. For short term, to minimize fight or flight during a family conflict, if you have the luxury of time, try to manage the environment. Identify a time and a location that's comfortable for everybody. Regardless, manage your mind-body connection when you're having conversations with your family, especially a conflict. Notice, how's your breathing? If it's shallow, take slow, deep breaths all the way into your abdomen. If your hand is on the stomach, you should be able to see it move. It's recommended that you breathe in through the nose, all the way into your stomach, and then slowly out through the mouth. That relieves tension. Are your muscles tense? Notice if you're making fists or clenching your jaws. And if you're doing that, consciously relax your muscles, relax your body. It will help. And pay attention to your language. Try not to yell, belittle, or swear. So these practice relaxation in response to fight or flight isn't just a feel-good therapist thing. It's the brainchild of a Dr. Herbert Benson, a Harvard cardiologist. He says you don't have to believe in it, and it doesn't even have to feel good to work. Dr. Benson likens it to brushing your teeth. If you do it, you're going to reap the benefits regardless of whether you're thinking about it or not. So I encourage you to integrate calm into your daily life and into your family interactions for your health and the health of the people you love. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I had a quick question for you regarding the fight or flight. It sounds like some of the things that you recommended are sort of like you're giving yourself permission to have a mental timeout before circumstances escalate.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that one of the things we don't think to do when we're in fight or flight is a short-term crisis situation. And we have to remind ourselves that we can take time for long term. So you can say to your child or your spouse, your father and I have to talk about this, we'll get back to you. You don't have to address and handle everything then. Ask the kids questions. Come up with creative solutions. Think about it if you need to and come back. And it may be a good idea to, before a conversation starts, to agree that if things get loud, if somebody needs a break, we have a 10-minute break where we think about the role we're playing in this situation and then come back together. Thank you.
Thanks. Before we move on to our next speaker, I want to take a brief moment to let everyone know, let the audience know, that the next Pathways to Parenting Success workshop is on November 28th, and it's somewhat related to this topic as well. It's minimizing drama and enhancing harmony in the family. This workshop takes place at the Meadows Branch Library at 4800 Baseline Road. It's right behind the Safeway, and that's from 6:30 to 8 p.m. on November 28th. And again, that features Dr. Elizabeth Matthews. So our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Olson. Dr. Olson has worked with children, adolescents, and families for almost 20 years in a variety of settings that include private practice, day treatment, residential treatment, and educational and community organizations. She also works with young adults and adults in her private practice. Dr. Olson also facilitates several psychotherapy groups. And I would just like to remind the audience that if you have any questions at any point in time, please feel free to submit your questions to us, and we will address them during the panel. Dr. Olson.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm going to talk very briefly on the adolescent brain and some ways that parents can hopefully be effective in connecting with that. And so the first thing that I wanted to say is just that in adolescence, one of the primary tasks that teenagers are working on, and also young adults as well, is building connections between the limbic part of their brain and the prefrontal cortex. And the limbic part of the brain is the part of the brain that basically governs our emotional responses and our emotional reactivity. The cortex, or the prefrontal cortex, governs what is called executive functioning skills. And the functions involved in executive functioning are things like being able to inhibit impulses, so developing impulse control, being able to think through and sequence, if I do this, then this is going to happen, so cause and effect. It also has to do with judgment, so being able to have a sense of making decisions that are going to be beneficial for you, that are going to be helpful. It really is the part of our brain where we're thinking things through, basically. And what I wanted to speak briefly about tonight is that the parent can actually, or the parents can be the cortex for their teenager. And actually the teenager really benefits from and needs the parent to do this for them. Because when we look at and kind of understand what's happening in the teenage brain, primarily it really involves the limbic system and the emotional reactivity, and they don't have as many pathways or neuronal networks yet between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic part of the brain. And so the parent, through their actions and the ways that they're interacting with their teenager or young adult, can really help to build those connections for them. Every time that the adolescent is able to be regulated and think something through, and when I say regulated, I mean that their emotional state is calm, it may not be relaxed, but at least it's not highly escalated. They are able to actually build neuronal pathways between the emotional part and the prefrontal cortex, which is really what we want them doing. And the brain is actively doing this actually up until the age of 25. There's been studies to show that the adolescent and the young adult brain, especially the young adult brain between the ages of 22 and 24 to 25, is actually, the prefrontal cortex is twice the size of that for adults after the age of 25. So the brain is very actively in adolescence and young adulthood working to build these connections. And part of how they build these connections is through the relationships that they have with their parents, and the parents being able to model and also provide this regulating function for them. Because most adolescents, as we know, they have really strong emotional responses. They're often very activated, very strong in the way that they're interacting with their parents, and that if the parent can stay calm and regulated, they can actually help the adolescent calm down as well. And so one of the ways that we talk about it is that the parent becomes the temporary cortex for the adolescent. And Kat Hunt and I are going to talk in a little bit and actually do an experiential of what not to do as a parent and then what to do as a parent. And so it should be fun. But what I was going to also just mention is that the goal that you're kind of looking for is a balance, so that you do want, it's not that we want no limbic brain and all prefrontal cortex, you actually want a balance between the two. Most of the time for adolescents, the balance is weighted, though, over on the emotional side. And what can happen is that parents can get drawn into this and kind of sucked into the emotionality of the moment. And what happens when parents do this is that they often end up in power struggles with their teenagers. They can start to feel hopeless. They can find themselves over-explaining situations. And what can sometimes result from that is that parents either go to the gratifying side, where they kind of give up, or they decide that it's more important to be more friends with their, adolescent, or more permissive in their parenting, or they can go to the other side and be more punitive and more punishing, and kind of, get caught up in, getting more and more frustrated and more escalated themselves. And so what we're actually looking for when you're the cortex for your adolescent is, how do you stay regulated as the parent? How do you stay in the middle where you're not gratifying, where you're not giving in to demands or things that you don't feel comfortable with, but at the same time, you're not being punitive or punishing, and you're not engaging in a power struggle. So Kat and I are going to talk in a little bit about a way to do that. The other thing that I wanted to just say, it's similar to what you were talking about, Elizabeth, is just that when you are in a conflict and you are finding yourself in a power struggle, there are ways out of it, and it's actually really critical to step away from the conflict, because when you're engaging, what often happens is that the parent is trying to be more and more reasonable and more explaining, this is the reason why, this is the reason why. And what happens is that the adolescent is actually getting more and more escalated, and the parent's coming along with them getting escalated. And the parent is trying to take that reason and that rationality and trying to connect to the adolescent who's in the emotion. They're not going to reason. They're not going to get the rational explanation at that time when the conflict is high. And so what's critical is to find ways to de-escalate it, and for the parent to be able to move out of the conflict and to stay regulated themselves, to stay in their own cortex, so that they can then be able to provide that for their teenager. And what happens is that the adolescent can get regulated. They can still have their emotions. They can still have that limbic experience, but they can calm it down. And when the limbic brain is more calm, they're much more likely to be able to access that prefrontal cortex. So I think Kat and I are going to talk a little bit more about how actually to do that. And I think that's it for me. I think that covers what I was going to talk about.
Okay, great. I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
You talked about the development of the limbic brain. So if as an adolescent and when the limbic brain is more in control and situations escalate, as they get older, will the tendency be in conflict situations for the limbic brain to go to that escalation place?
Well, the hope is that that will not be the case. And there is, just by maturity, just by developing, that does seem to quiet down a little bit more over time. But for some people who really don't learn these skills and have these abilities to get regulated through the modulating that they get from their parents, if they don't learn how to do that, they can actually develop patterning in their brain that lasts past the age of 25, where they're still reacting very strongly in their interpersonal relationships, sometimes at work. And, you can see that sometimes in adults who have trouble regulating themselves. And one of the things that can be difficult in this situation is that parents can pass down, through their own ways of regulating, they can teach that to their kids for how to regulate, which is why it's so important that parents do everything they can, like I think what Elizabeth was talking about, the suggestions that you were making. The more that the parent can stay regulated, the more that they can model that for their child. So, yeah. And over time, it definitely can get more regulated.
Great.
So it's almost a developmental task, really. So.
Thank you. So I wanted to remind people again, if you're in the live audience, to submit your questions. If you're watching at home or online, you can submit your questions to www.boulderpsychologicalservices.com and click on Submit the Questions icon. A few more things that are coming up shortly. On December 5th, Pathways to Parenting Success will be here again in the BVSD boardroom from 7 to 8 p.m., speaking about our body image obsession. And this will be a discussion with youth, parents, and counselors and community groups about a challenge that can be ultimately become life-threatening if not treated. So I think that that will be an interesting topic for discussion as well. Our next speaker is Kat Austin. Kat Austin is a licensed professional counselor, licensed addictions counselor, and currently in private practice in Boulder. Kat has worked with adolescents, young adults, and their families for 10 years. Her area of expertise include drug and alcohol abuse and addiction, family conflict, conflict, marital issues, transitional and adjustment issues, and oppositional defiance, which sounds like perfect for this topic tonight.
Thank you. Okay, so thanks for having me here today, and I'm going to piggyback off what Elizabeth Olsen was talking about as far as regulation issues, and talk about one way to really dispel the power struggle that all adolescents can pull parents into so readily. And so this skill is called validation, and we all know what validation means, but it's really to confirm or to verify or authenticate. Validation can be verbal or nonverbal. So that we have validation on one hand. Well, what's the opposite of validation? Well, it's invalidation. And this negates or dismisses behavior independent of actual validity of the behavior. And so it means to weaken or to nullify, to cancel, to reject, or to dismiss. And so when you hear the definition of invalidate, to me, that's the very essence of family conflict, that an adolescent or a parent is feeling dismissed or rejected and having this emotional experience around feeling the hurt around invalidation. And so knowing that validating it helps calm the system. Many fights in families can start with just one invalidating comment. Not intentionally, just kind of off the cuff, and the next thing you know, you have a child that's like blowing up at you, and you're like, man, what did I even do? Or you set a limit with your child, and the child doesn't like it, and so they're very angry. And what Elizabeth was talking about is, so they're angry and they're really upset with this limit that's going on, and they're in the limbic system of their brain, and they can't get those neural pathways to go into the reasonable part of their brain. And what I hear parents say all the time in my practice is, gosh, it's almost like my kid isn't listening to me. Well, they're not, because they really can't. It's almost like you're speaking a different language when you're trying to reason with them and get them to understand why you're setting the limit. And so validation will help pull you out of that power struggle and help slow down the process for your child. It will also help your child develop identification around their feelings and what could be going on for them. So how do you validate? What does it look like? I look at it in several levels. So the first level I look at is just showing interest in nonverbal cues. So showing general interest in your child. Don't be doing the dishes when they're trying to have a conversation with you. Actually stop and sit down and look at them and show them the nonverbal cues. Shake your head, give them prompts. Tell me more is an excellent phrase for any parent to say. Sometimes adolescents don't go there, but it's giving them the avenue to speak freely, which is really helpful. So the second level is just reflection. And so using accurate reflection of what you feel is going on for your child. So you're frustrated that you possibly can miss, or that I'm telling you that you have to miss the basketball game. I can understand how that would be frustrating for you. All of the other kids are going and you're having to miss it. That's tough. So just reflecting. It's important to take a non-judgmental stance with your child, be matter of fact, have an of course attitude, because of course this child that I was just talking about is going to be frustrated about missing the basketball game. It makes sense. Trying to read the person's behavior and imagine what they could be thinking or feeling or wishing for. checking for accuracy and not making assumptions. And so being able to connect past events and present events. So for example, being able to validate a child when they're not able to go talk to their math teacher. Oh, your math teacher reminds you of your English teacher who you hated last year. So it makes sense you would be really scared. So again, bringing that feeling piece into what the validation is. And then just treating your child as valid, not patronizing, not condescending, recognizing that they have strengths and limitations, and being genuine within yourself. And I think Elizabeth Matthews talked about this. If you're in your fight or flight response, it's going to be really hard for you to be genuine in your responses. And so being able to take that time out and then be able to validate what's going on for your child will help slow it down so that your child can re-regulate, and then you guys can actually have, the hope is, a reasonable conversation. So that being said, Elizabeth and I are going to do a little role play, and how we're going to play this is, because the best way to show validation is to show it the wrong way and then the right way. So I'm going to play the adolescent, and Elizabeth is going to play the parent. And our conflict is going to be around curfew, which I'm guessing most watchers can have experienced. So.
And I wanted to first apologize, too, that I was referring to Kat as Kat Hunt, and she's Kat Austin. I've just known her for a really long time, so
That's okay.
that's why. So, okay.
Okay. Hi, Mom.
Hi, sweetheart.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So I really want to go to the basketball game tonight, and I want to stay late on my curfew because they're all going to go have like this big party over at Kelsey's house, and so I want to be home at like 1:30.
You know, that's too late, honey. I don't want you staying out that late. Your curfew is 12 o'clock,
Mom,
and that's when
Mom, you've let me stay out till
Kat,
1:30.
You just interrupted me, and I do not appreciate being interrupted.
But you let me stay out till 1:30 before.
You're not even listening to
You're
what
right,
I'm saying.
because you're not listening
That's
to me.
right. You're right. I'm not going to when you're talking to me like this. This is not an acceptable tone to come in. You don't just
No.
march in here. Your
I
curfew,
asked in a nice way.
Let me tell you something. Your curfew is 12 o'clock, and that is that. And if you want to be pissed, you can be pissed.
Well, fine.
That's right. Fine.
Exit to my bedroom, slammed the door. Everybody's mad. I'm in there crying, texting Kelsey. My mom. So we're going to play fast forward. Elizabeth has gone through family counseling. She has learned to validate, and so this is how it would go. Hey, Mom, can I ask you a question?
Of course, sweetie. What is it?
Well, Kelsey's having this big party at her house, and so we're going to go to the basketball game, and then I would like to stay out until 1:30.
Well, your curfew is actually 12.
I know, but you've let me stay out till 1:30 before.
I know. That's true. I have.
And so I feel like this is a special occasion, and you always say special occasions, it's okay.
You really want me to make an exception here.
I do. I want you to make an exception.
I hear that. I hear that. I know you do.
But can I?
Well, I've said that your curfew is 12, and that's what it is. And I know that's really, really hard for you to hear right now. I know it's so frustrating for you to hear me say that.
Yeah, I'm mad.
I know you are. I know, and that's okay. What would help you right now? Because I know you're really, really angry. What would help?
I guess I'll just go upstairs.
All right, that's okay to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
No slamming of the door. So that's just two examples of really me pulling Elizabeth into a power struggle and wanting to do the reasoning, setting really firm limits, going kind of over to that rigid side that she was talking about, and then the validating role play just really in the center and being able to notice how frustrated I was and how disappointing it was for me, and also hold the boundary. So that's it for me.
Thank you. I have to admit that no mom kind of rang some bells for me, being the mother of a newly minted 13-year-old. So I did have a question for you as well about that. One of the things that struck me when you were speaking is it seems like that a part of this is in the communication patterns for the parent to step back and realize it's not about the parent,
Yeah.
but it's about what the teen is trying to express in terms of what their needs are.
Absolutely. And this is a piece that I forgot to say, and I think it follows up with this, is that validation doesn't mean that you have to actually agree with the person. And I think that parents get really stuck in, well, I don't want to validate that because I don't agree with, whatever choice my child is making. And so I think it's really important to know that it doesn't mean that you're necessarily agreeing with them. It means that you're seeing your child for what's going on with them. Does that make sense in what you're saying?
Great, thank you. So I'd like to quickly, again, make a plea for questions from our live audience, as well as those watching online, to go to www.boulderpsychologicalservices.com, submit questions, and then to let you know again about another upcoming event. This is a little further. Well, actually, no, this is this week. The Parent Engagement Network is sponsoring a talk on Boys and Girls Relate Differently, Celebrating Family Relationships, Speak Out, Speak Up. And that will be here at the BVSD Ed Center from 5:45 to 8:45 p.m. this coming Wednesday, November 9th. So our last panelist, last but not least, Dan, and apparently our only male on the panel tonight, is Dan Fox. For the past 15 years, Dan has positively impacted youth as a school counselor, classroom teacher, high school principal, adjunct professor, and psychotherapist. He is currently supervising staff at a residential program for young adults and in private practice in Boulder, serving teenagers, young adults, and families. Dan.
Thanks. Perhaps the most relevant part of my background is that I also have been on this parenting journey now for 6 years, and I have 3 kids, and really like almost everything you guys said was like directly relevant, and I feel like I should just take notes and start doing that at home. In fact, when I told my wife last night what this topic was, I said it's reducing family conflict. She kind of looked at me with this like, really? And I said, yeah, I know it's ironic. It really is. And I guess that sort of brings me to my first point, which is that at least in our house, there's a certain amount of conflict that is, I think it's somewhat inevitable. One of my tasks as a father is to get the kids up in the morning, and my oldest goes to school, and I pile the other 2 in with me. And as it turns out, the 2 biggest kids never want to get up. So we already have this sort of difference. Like my goal is to get them up and out, and their goal is to stay sleeping. So I think there's just a certain amount of conflict inherent there. This morning, my son wanted to bike, and it was cold outside. He's only 4, and I knew we were either going to have a conflict about, no, you can't bike, or as we started biking, he would realize this isn't going to work, and he would not want to bike anymore, but then he'd be on his bike instead of in the little stroller. So we'd have an extra bike and nowhere to put it. So there's this inevitability of conflict, and I feel like there's something about figuring out how to not be so scared of disagreements and not be as worried about it, so that our frustration and our anger doesn't come up and be as much in play. And I think so much of what you guys talked about in terms of being able to kind of regulate ourselves, I think makes it possible to, when it is time to sort of engage in some conflict, we have this sense of being prepared. And so that's what I hope to talk more about now, is this idea that there are some boundaries that we want to have in place with our kids. And there are some consequences that we need to have to enforce these boundaries. And that's going to create a certain amount of conflict. But if we have a coherent plan, if we have a strategy in place, then I think it takes away so much of the frustration when things aren't going well, or so much of the sense of just, here's my kids doing these things, and I have no options. I'm sort of lost, and I don't know how to control this situation. So we want to talk about having a plan in place. And if I can be of any use to you guys, I would suggest that the idea of like the curfew that you guys were talking about in terms of that role play, like you know your kids, and there's something about knowing ahead of time what they're likely to be doing. So the holidays are coming up. If you're going on a trip, you might want to think about what they're likely to do on a trip. If you're having family come into town, you might want to think about what they're likely to do with extended family staying at the house for a while. So I think there's something about having a plan and really being able to kind of anticipate the things that are likely to come up that are difficult for your kids. The second thing that I think is important is to then preview your plan. So there's so much about this role play that I love, but one of the things was you as the adolescent already knew that the curfew was midnight. And I think that's really important, is that any boundaries that we're trying to put in place, if we've rehearsed them, if we've talked about them ahead of time, and if our kids are old enough, if we've been able to include them in the process of creating these boundaries, we've done a lot to be able to kind of implement the consequences when a boundary gets broken. So if we're previewing it, I think we save a lot of energy, both for our kids being kind of shocked, but also for ourselves sort of thinking on the fly. I've found that I'm really bad at coming up with a good consequence for my kids when I'm frustrated and when I don't have a plan in place. It usually ends up going to this idea of if I can find the right motivational tool, I can force them to do what I want, which that hasn't panned out in my experience as a parent or a professional, but it's something that I go to when I'm really frustrated. So if I've got a plan and I've previewed it, I've got half a chance. The next thing that I've got to keep in mind, which I would suggest for you guys too, is that there's this assumption that if we put these boundaries in place and we talk about them with our kids, that they're going to do it. And I think that assumption is actually true for like a good part of the time. But another important assumption is that they're not going to follow the boundaries a lot of the time. And when they do, if we can kind of stay calm, not get to our sort of more frustrated emotional places like you guys were talking about, I think that really gives us this position to actually enforce the boundaries with this level of equanimity. If we're planning on them needing to get enforced, then when it happens, there's less of this outrage, or the sense of like, it's like a personal attack that our kids sort of said they were going to do this, they listened, they nodded, and they must have lied to us or just been trying to hurt our feelings because they're not obeying now. Usually I think it's much more complicated than that. On the other end of the consequences, I think it's really important to then kind of review things, to follow up, to troubleshoot after the fact. I love the ideas about exiting. I think it's good to sort of, if you're in a situation where you're trying to enforce a consequence and you realize it's getting escalated and there is an exiting process that happens, we want to come back later on and make sure, have things gotten back to normal? Do we still like the boundaries that are in place? Do we like the consequences? Are we more on track for the next time? I think it's important to work with our kids collaboratively on that process to kind of minimize this whole excess conflict that comes in when we're not really as aware and having as coherent a plan. On that topic, the last thing is, I think if we can get some sense of, we're a team, like let's figure this out together. How can we work on this instead of what you're doing wrong? If it's a we thing, I think it helps to minimize that me versus them feeling that our kids have sometimes. Coming at this from a slightly different direction, there's another thing I want to say about parenting, and I think it is that as our kids get older, there's a lot of letting go that we need to do. If our life was a car, if our kids' life was a car, by the time they're adults, they're really steering it. And us as parents, when they're little, we get to be the driver. And when they're teenagers, we're sort of jockeying for control of the wheel, and their limbic brain is attacking us, and we're trying to stay calm. But ultimately, I think it's important to recognize that at the end of the day, or the end of this journey, we want to grow adults. We want them to be able to steer their own car. And I think that comes up against a very tricky part of being a parent, which is that when I think about my kids, I want them to grow, and I want them to just be happy. And I also have to admit, though, that there's this part of me that kind of views sort of certain things like, well, what if she's like this? Or maybe he's going to be interested in that. And there's a certain level of that I think is wonderful. And when they're little, we can kind of encourage a lot of these activities. But at a certain point, this journey gets more and more in their court. So let me give you an example. I've tweaked this slightly to protect the innocent and guilty in this scenario. But the thing I wanted to talk about was a dad I knew who really wanted his daughter, who was 16, to go to a theater camp. Now, if you guys have 16-year-olds and they've never been in an activity before and you're trying to get them to do it now, you'll know like what an uphill battle it is to start something new with somebody that age when they haven't done it at an earlier stage in life and they don't already feel like an expert at it. So he was trying to get her to do this new theater thing at a camp she'd never been to before, and she was 16. And in February, this got kind of ironed out in a battle where his sort of rule of the day won the situation, and he kind of forced this, and she sort of begrudgingly said fine, because there was really not much other space. But time wore on, and as 16-year-olds tend to do, she kept sort of wheedling away at this situation. And by June, it was apparent that this was going to fall apart, and she really was digging her heels in and didn't want to go to this summer camp. So somewhere in June, the dad says, fine, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to, but you owe me $1,200 for the cost of the summer camp. And this is one of those moments where I think we're looking for, if I can find that right motivational tool, if I can find that right consequence, I can force them to do what I want. And so I think that's what we were hoping for at that point. So he tried that, and unfortunately she says, okay, good, because I'm not going to go to the camp, so we'll figure out the $1,200. Well, if your 16-year-old owes you $1,200, this is kind of a rough, conflict-inducing situation that's going to last for months and months and months and months and months. And as this sort of wore on throughout the summer, she'd eventually sort of half paid off about $100. There were some chores around the house. The allowance got dinged a little bit. But they were getting to this situation where all of a sudden, this had become this like major theme in this family's life, where her debt to them and her unwillingness to sort of pay it off quickly was really kind of eating up the situation, and her feeling that she had been set up from day one was keeping her from having any desire to really sort of participate in problem solving. So I would submit this whole example to you guys as something that as parents we want to be extremely cautious about, which is trying to steer situations where really we ought to be stepping back a little bit and letting go and fueling more. There's something about, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer in having our teens have structured activities, giving them things that they can do that have other adults in the equation, getting them out of town over the summer. By all means, if you can do that with your teens, do it this summer, do it this winter break, get them those kinds of experiences. But if we're forcing it, and we're forcing it to an extent like that, where we're really creating additional family conflict, I don't actually think we're going to get the benefit, and we're going to create a whole lot of additional unnecessary struggle that doesn't actually get us to this place where they're learning more about how to steer their own car. So my hope for you guys is that you're able to kind of think about the idea of steering versus fueling, and that at a younger age, we definitely are steering our kids' car, so to speak. As they're getting older, we want to pass that off more and more completely to them, so that by the time they're adults, they've really had this experience of wrestling with these kinds of challenges and figuring out how to resolve things in their life without us trying to sort of do it for them in a way that we might think or even know might help them out, but ultimately they've got to kind of sort that stuff out on their own. I think that's all I'm going to say for right now.
Thanks, Dan. I have a quick question for you as well. So for parents or families that want assistance in developing that plan, establishing those boundaries, and looking at appropriate consequences, what would you recommend?
That's a great question. I was actually thinking of describing the POUR system that we use at my house as an example. So I'll do that with this caveat, which is that I don't think the system itself is as critical as a continual willingness to kind of keep working at it and recognize that until you come up with a strategy that's sustainable for your family, there's work to be done. And we ought to find something that actually provides some relief and some path forward and some ability. If we're working with this idea that we need to be the cortex for our kids and that they're kind of operating on this more emotional level, our system should actually help that process. It should work. So if we haven't gotten there, we need to spend more time figuring that out. Now, having said all that, the system I use, and we've got little kids, has to do with a star chart. And they accumulate a bunch of stars over time based on 4 or 5 key behaviors that we're focusing on. So we want to promote the positive behaviors. And if they get a bunch of their stars filled, then they're able to take their chart and cash it in for something like watching a little television or things like that. If they really mess something up, we have what we call a fix-it box, which is an extra little box in their chart that they have to fill with an extra star. And the funny thing is, before we had this in place, I didn't have as many sort of options to go to when I got frustrated. And somehow the chart, even though at times it's like we don't have one on the wall and we don't know where it is and we sort of lose track of it. It's something that we keep coming back to, and it really helps when we get to those frustrated places to just have an option that's something other than escalation.
Thanks, Dan. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a few minutes to respond to the questions that we've received from our audience members and online. I would again urge people in the audience to provide us with your questions, or if you're watching from home, to submit your questions to www.boulderpsychologicalservices.com and click on the Submit Questions icon. So our first question came to us online, and it is, what is the most appropriate response when your 9-year-old fights you physically, such as hitting, wrestling, kicking, or biting to get their way? What should a parent do in the moment, and what should be done after the child has calmed down? I've tried keeping my voice low, staying calm, looking my child in the eye, and speaking firmly with phrases such as, please stop, let me go now, etc. My child is an intelligent, loving, sensitive child who has very intense moments of anger at times. And I believe, Dr. Olson, you're going to respond first?
Sure. My thoughts about that are that I'm actually wondering what's going on prior to the incident. So I know that part of what you're wanting to know about is what to do in the moment and what to do after, which I can also speak to. But what I'm really interested in is what's going on that might be triggering this behavior in your child. And so what you might want to look at is there a particular time of day where it happens? Is there something going on at school that might be causing stress, or something that might be going on in the family, either some significant transition or something that could be triggering this kind of behavior? Other things to think about are just how much sleep your child got the night before, what they've eaten that day, are they hungry? And kind of to be, as much as you can as a parent, assessing what's going on before we get to this place. What am I doing? And a lot of times, we as parents, I'm a parent also, might be doing things that we don't know could be contributing to the behavior. They may not be able at 9 to put into words what it is that's going on for them. And so a lot of what I think can be helpful is to try to make guesses about what might be going on. And while you're in the moment, I think the best that you can do to make the situation safe, to have really firm boundaries that we do not hurt each other in this house, that is not acceptable, and at the same time to be validating. I know you're really mad, I know you're angry, and I want you to use your words. Something that I've heard works well and that I sometimes have done with my son when he's angry is to put my hands out and to do some pushing with just the hands, just because sometimes they need a physical discharge to be able to do some just physical releasing. The other thing to think about too is he getting enough of an emotional discharge? Is he going to school and getting stressed and then comes home and has an explosion? Does he need to be getting on his bike and doing a bike ride? Or is he a kid that might need some physical exercise or something to have a release for some of that energy? And then afterwards, I think, is really important. A lot of what they talk about in the literature around conflicts between parents and kids really has to do with the repairing afterwards. And sometimes I know it's really easy to want to get into that punitive mode, but if you can pull yourself back and try to look at what's the function of this behavior, what is going on, and to try to really understand what's happening and to help them put it into words as much as possible, they might not need the behavior. So as much as you can, sometimes also with aggression, there's fear underneath it. There might be something scaring him. And also sometimes it's sadness. Sometimes something has happened at school that they've kind of held together throughout the whole day. They get home and then they just kind of get angry or hostile or aggressive. And then if you can just kind of stay steady and validating but firm, sometimes you can get them to what's the feeling underneath that. There's a great website that I'd recommend doing some reading on called Hand in Hand Parenting, and it has a lot of tips also for working with kids who have aggressive behaviors as well. So,
Great, thank you. Did any of the other panelists want to add anything? Okay, so I'm going to go to this question from the audience next, because I think it kind of relates a little bit since our next online question is also for younger kids. So the panel talked quite a bit about conflict with adolescents, I think particularly in terms of the adolescent brain and validation. So can you speak to conflict with younger children? Are there important differences in some of the things that we touched on in the panel tonight? Anybody want to take this one? I'll go with Dan because he smiled.
I think the short answer is yes, there are important differences. One of the things that I would focus on, I mean, it's certainly like with my own kids, one of the things, and I've had more experience with teenagers professionally, so I've run the mistake of using interventions that I would use with teenagers on my littler kids, and it doesn't work. And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times I take for granted that their ability to reason is a little more sophisticated than it is, and their ability to kind of take other people's perspectives is a little more developed than it is. And I think it's worth still encouraging your younger kids to try to think about these things in a broader way, to try to understand somebody else's position, to try to work as a team, to try to take some responsibility for problem solving or brainstorming consequences. But I think with younger kids, there's a very different level in terms of like who's truly in charge here. And a lot of times I think with a little kid, you can have these clear boundaries and consequences that you put in place that will be sustainable for a period of time, maybe even years, pre-adolescence. And by the time somebody's a teenager, well, part of their job at that point is to inspect some of these boundaries and test them out and eventually make them their own and internalize them. But in the meantime, there's a lot more, I think, external conflict that they have because the world is growing larger and there are more risks that they can be taking. So you as a parent need to really get in there and be careful about how are you working with them as they kind of go through this adolescent process and start to become their own boss, so to speak. I think with teenagers, a lot of times we have to put in a lot of joining work, validating work, connecting work, because there's often a little more baseline conflict. But our kids are much more willing to sort of take at face value that, like, you're the adult, you're the one that's in charge of this stuff, and battling over authority doesn't happen to the same extent at that age. Okay,
great. In the interest of getting to all of the questions that we have tonight, I think I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the questions after a response, if that works for you.
Sure.
So our next question is also related to a younger child. Our family conflict currently tends to originate with our eldest. He is 8.5 and spends most of his day as a supreme pest. Being the oldest, there is no one who can give him a taste of his own medicine, and I just don't know how to get him to understand why he needs to be kinder and sweeter to his younger siblings. I understand that bugging one's siblings is a part of growing up, but how can I get him to at least tone it down a bit? Kat?
Sibling rivalry is such a tough one. And the one thought that I have about this question and ways that I've worked with this with families is, when do you catch your kids doing the right thing? And by that I mean, there's a school of thought with positive behavior reinforcement that your kids are going to fight, there's going to be sibling rivalry, but what is the parent doing to contribute to the escalated sibling rivalry? Is that how they're getting attention? Is that how your kiddo, who is very, very, very nasty sometimes, getting you to say, hey, and set a limit with him? And so I like to look at it in this way, in this positive reinforcement. Say you have 3 kids and they're sitting in front of the TV and they're watching TV, and you're in the den and you're typing on the computer and you're doing work. The school of thought is, especially when you're trying to catch them doing something right, is every 7 to 10 minutes going in there and telling them, hey, you guys are doing a really great job not fighting right now, and leaving. 10 minutes later, hey, I really like that I'm not hearing you yell. It's really nice for my ears. 10 minutes later, Hey, thank you so much for being so fantastic and allowing me to do my work while you guys are sitting here so nicely watching TV together. And so the more that you can reinforce some of that positive behavior, the more and more that will start showing up.
Great, thank you. So we have two questions that I'm hoping we can get to in the next 5 or so minutes. The first one is, can someone talk a little bit about parentification and those dynamics and how to establish a healthy balance of power or authority? And then the second question is, given the star chart just discussed, what would be a similar tool for a 16-year-old boy? And so let's address the question on parentification first.
And so I'm assuming that means that your child is acting like the parent? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think that what's happening developmentally is kids are learning how to be independent. And they're learning how to be independent from you and think for themselves. Parents are learning how to keep their kids safe. And so sometimes those are kind of in conflicts. I think that if you can take your child seriously and let them take an honest interest in what their opinion is and hear it and let them win every now and then, you can set up some boundaries and even say, I'm the parent here and it's my job to keep you safe, and I really hate how much stress you're putting on yourself right now. I think, and Kat had alluded to it earlier, when any conflict is happening with your family, if you can somehow agree with where the other person's coming from, and I don't mean say, yes, you're right, you should have the car, but I understand that you're frustrated. I understand that you think that you know the answer. I understand that your brother and sisters are bothering you and you're scared for them and you think, no, it's best for them. This is my job. You really should just be a kid now. But also listen to them and validate them. They might have some really good information.
Great, thank you. So the question related to the star chart, what would be an appropriate tool for a 16-year-old boy?
I have a quick thought on that, and then I'll just defer to you guys. This sort of brings me back to that question of what's the difference between younger kids and teenagers. Because a star chart like this, I think you can take most 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, those are my kids' ages that we're doing the star chart with, and they'll just do it. You just tell them how it works, and they'll just relate to it. But you present this to a lot of 16-year-olds, and they'll be like, I'm not into this. I don't want to do this. Why do we have to do this? Why can't you just give me allowance the normal way, or whatever it is? So there's this level of negotiation, and I think really working with your teen on figuring out how can we create something that promotes positive behaviors and has some way of, as a parent, you being able to kind of reinforce and have consequences for things that come up. So that was my piece.
I'll just say really briefly that I think if you want to help influence behavior in a positive way, the more that you can kind of predict where there's trouble spots and try to address them before they become escalated, the better. And also that the more that you can reinforce positives, like what Kat was saying, just really trying to be aware of giving positives as much as possible, then that will help. The more that you get into the consequences and the punitive, the harder it is actually to change behavior, because some kids actually get reinforced, believe it or not, by punishment. And so it's just one of those things that I think you have to be mindful about as a parent. And then, if you are going to do it, you can, what motivates them? You may not do a star chart, but yeah, what interests them? You were going to say something too, it seemed
Well, I
like.
was going to talk a little bit about how I work with it in my practice, and that is from forming agreements. And I don't call them home contracts because I really don't like that word. And to me, that kind of goes from top down. And speaking to what Dan is speaking to, being able to pull your 16-year-old in and creating an agreement with them. So setting up, and how I work with this is that I'll have the 16-year-old come up with 5 expectations that they would have. What would their consequences be? What would their privileges be? Parents come up with something similar, 5 expectations, consequences, privileges. And then you guys get together and talk about it and discuss it and negotiate, because what a wonderful skill to teach your adolescent to negotiate and to speak effectively in getting what they want. And what this does is also help parents to be able to come from that very validating place, because your boundaries your boundaries are set up and your consequences are set up. So it gives adolescents a choice point around, I'm going to stay out later for my curfew, and I know what the consequence is going to be. And so it really reduces power struggles that happen in the family system by just that whole process.
And I'll just add one quick thing. It's really important to be consistent with that. That if you're going to say the curfew is 12, make it 12. If you're okay with there being a 15-minute, in between time there, stick with what that is. But be very consistent about if you are going to give a consequence, when you're going to do that. Yes.
Great, thank you. So I would like to thank our panelists tonight, our live audience, and our home audience. I would also like to thank the sponsors for Pathways to Parenting Success, which include Boulder Counseling Cooperative, Boulder County Healthy Youth Alliance, Boulder Public Library Foundation, the Boulder Valley School District, Centennial Peaks Hospital, the Parent Engagement Network, the Daily Camera, and the Hope Coalition. This presentation this evening would not be able to be possible without the support of our partners, the Boulder Valley School District and the Boulder Valley Media Alliance and Channel 22. As I mentioned earlier in the show, upcoming in Pathways to Parenting Success on November 28th is Minimizing Drama and Enhancing Harmony in the Family with Elizabeth Matthews. This will focus on learning to identify and prevent the triggers of relationship drama. And that's Monday, November 28th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. at the Meadows Branch Library, 4800 Baseline Road. The next Channel 22's show in the series is on December 5th, our Body Image Obsession, an interactive discussion with youth, parents, counselors, and community groups, and that will be moderated by Dr. Jan Hittleman. And this week we have coming up on November 9th, Boys and Girls Relate Differently, Celebrating Family Relationships, Speak Out, Speak Up, at 5:45 to 8:45 here at the BVSD Ed Center, 6500 Arapahoe Road. You can find out more about all of the community events, particularly Pathways to Parenting Success, by visiting the website at boulderpsychologicalservices.com. Thank you, and see you again next time.
Now the planet's going down, and soon the growth returns to follow ground. But I know what's churning underneath the snow, and I love my baby, and we've miles to go. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Be with me. We'll beat this, can't you see? So wait a while, winter time. Wait a while, winter time.